Have you ever read a passage of the Bible that was hard to make sense of? Well, if you haven't, I got one for you. Psalm 58. As I turned through the pages of this psalm, I found some verses that just grabbed my attention and were really quite confusing for me to know exactly how to make sense of them right away. I read this in verse 8. May they be like a slug that melts away as it moves along, like a stillborn child that never sees the sun. Pretty jarring language. Well, then I read this in verse 10. The righteous will be glad when they are avenged, when they dip their feet in the blood of the wicked. Not necessarily a verse you'd reference at the end of a birthday card. But this passage is important. And as we can get through some of that difficult language, we actually find that this is an incredibly important text for you and I today. See, in verses 1 and 2, I think we get the frame we need to understand what's being talked about. We read this in verse 1. The psalmist asks this question. Do you rulers indeed speak justly? Do you judge people with equity? He's asking about justice, and he's asking about it from the highest levels, from those that create the systems under which people live. And he says, do you from that level speak justly and treat people with equity? Well, as soon as he asks the question, he answers it. In verse 2, he says, no. In your heart you devise injustice, and your hands mete out violence on the earth. This is a passage about justice, but not just justice on the individual level. It's about justice on the social level. He is talking about the people that create systems that actually devise injustice and devise violence among the vulnerable. This passage invites us in to the pursuit not just of justice on the individual level, but social justice on a much broader level. Now, this kind of distinction about justice and social justice, I think, is hard to get our hands around sometimes. But I'd like to tell you a parable from another book I read that I think illustrates what social justice is pretty well. The parable talks about a town that was built just beyond the bend in a river. And one morning, the people from the town saw 3 bodies floating downstream to them. Well, they rushed in and grabbed the bodies. The first body was dead, and they found a way to properly care for that deceased body. The second body was incredibly wounded, and so they gave it the medical care it needed to have its health restored. And the third body was a young child who had been orphaned without a family. And they took that child in, and they gave it a family and a new life to live. Well, they had handled that day's tragedies and that day's trials. But the next morning when they woke up, they found themselves in the same situation. 3 more bodies had floated down the river. Well, they scooped them up and cared for them the best they knew how. Well, day after day, that kept happening. And so after a time, they devised better systems to get the bodies out of the river and better ways to care for the bodies in the ways that they needed. And they actually felt some pride around all the ways that they had devised to handle those bodies floating down the river. And what the author of the parable says is that is actually doing charity. Necessary, good, important work. He says, but if you wanted to pursue social justice, you would try to find the social injustice at its cause. You would take a team up around the bend in the river to see what you hadn't yet seen and to find the, at the time, unknown causes of why all those bodies ended up in the river and were floating downstream. He says that's what it means to pursue social justice. In his words, he says this, private charity responds to the homeless, wounded, and dead bodies, but it does not itself try to get at the reasons why they are there. Social justice tries to go upriver and change the reasons that create homeless, wounded, and dead bodies. I think the pursuit of social justice is something that we might all long to know how to do, but don't yet know how to do. We see areas of injustice in our world and are quick to help in many ways. But we sometimes fail to do the work necessary to discover the causes of those sources of injustice. See, I think this is hard work, and I don't have all the answers of how we'll do that. But I know that areas of injustice, social injustice, exist in our world today. And I think the call of this psalm on you and I is to try to pursue not just private charity, which is good and necessary and a wonderful thing to be about. I think the call of this psalm on our lives is to pursue social justice. One of the areas that the author in this story points to as well is racial injustice. He says this, He says charity is about treating your neighbors with respect, while justice is about trying to get at the deeper roots of racism. I think that live question of do people that help create the systems under which we live pursue injustice is as live today as it was in the time of the psalmist. And while I don't have all the answers here today, I think that this exists is real, and that you and I need to be the kinds of people that go up around the bend in the river and see what we haven't yet seen, and discover the, to us, unseen causes of injustice, and do everything we can to stand against them and try to fight for justice in God's world. I'm a person that is trying to make this shift in my own life, and I'd like to invite you to do the same, to help private charity needs when we see them, but also try to understand and ask enough questions and get enough information to understand where systemic social injustice exists in our world today, and do our best to engage it at the root cause, up around the bend in the river. This is a big order and a big command and a big ask of us that the Bible is making. But I'd like to be in this, and I'd like you to join me as well.